what we can see is that there's tremendous support. There's belief in the model. This model is not something that is unique to only Montgomery County, Maryland, or to Chattanooga, Tennessee. It's something that can happen here and something that voters want to have happen.
That's Tiffany McCoy of How's Our Neighbors speaking to me on Seattle Channel a few weeks ago with what appears to be a very prescient assessment of support for social housing in Seattle. Election night returns show that voters support it and support the funding measure that How's Our Neighbors has presented, a new tax on highly paid employees. We're going to break down what that means. Plus, a split decision for the Seattle City Council on crowd control measures for the Seattle Police Department with so-called less lethal weapons. And we'll also take a dive into building permitting in the Emerald City. We're looking at all these topics, time permitting, this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm with my good friend and co-host, David Croman. David, thanks for joining me. At least the lineup is set for the Mariners broadcast team. Just wanted your take. Do you think former M's great Jay Buhner is going to be able to hold it down in the booth? He seems like the one question mark to me, if I may.
Yeah, I don't know. I've always found him I find him entertaining. I don't know how deep his analysis will go, so we'll see.
Let's have fun with it. I think that's the whole motto to the season here, I guess. Well, thanks very much, David. Great to be with you once again. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. John, looking out at you on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks, man. Thanks always to the show patrons. And heads up, some patrons first content coming later on this week. Keep an eye out for that. Patrons get that benefit. We also answer your questions about local politics on the show. So please drop us a line, patrons, if you would like. That's Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Spell it out at gmail.com. Also, when you support Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon, you get your very own snazzy sticker to put on your coffee mug, laptop. So make sure you jump in and join the fun. Those stickers are awesome. I've sent out a few over the past couple weeks. Thanks for jumping in, patrons. A big thanks also to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get rolling. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, we just had a special election here in February, and the results of the social housing measure must have Prop 1A supporters feeling pretty special. In this two-part question, 68% of voters said yes to Part 1. Again, looking at election night results here, that's Seattle's social housing developer should receive funding. 68% of voters said yes to that. Part 2, 58% of voters said yes to a plan that would get that funding from a new tax on companies with employees earning over $1 million a year. The amount they make over $1 million would be taxed. And yes, these are early results, but it looks like a really strong start here, David. And that 58% really dwarfs the 42% who supported Prop 1B, the city council and chamber-backed version, which would have taken money from the existing Jumpstart payroll tax on big businesses and put it towards other affordable housing measures. I just wanted to get that first take. Were you surprised by this result?
Yeah, I was a little bit, frankly, just because, it's we are always very, very conservative at the paper about declaring victory. So, we still leave open the possibility that things could change. But, history shows that the more, considered more progressive of two options on election night tends to do a little worse in that first drop. Basically, if the more progressive of the two is tied or even down just a little bit, it's generally believed that later vote counts will favor that option. And so, going into this, I assumed it would be pretty close between the two, and then I wasn't sure kind of where it would go in the later days. So the fact that Prop 1A, which I think, is probably widely viewed as kind of the more progressive of the two options, was doing as well as it is, I expect that margin to grow in the coming days. Yeah. It would be surprising if it didn't. And so, again, at the paper, we don't declare victory for any one candidate usually, unless it's super overwhelming, and we usually give it a couple days. But if I'm a backer of the 1A option, I'm feeling pretty confident that this is the final result.
And in terms of how they did it, it had the support of a number of local state reps and senators like Nicole Macri, Daria Farivar, Frank Chop. It almost seemed like, I don't know, maybe they used that Democratic framework to get this result here. How do you think they did it, David? What do you think about that?
There's a lot of chatter about the kind of more moderate, whatever you want to call it, conservative backlash over the last few years. And I think that's real. And I think that was grounded in concerns about public safety.
Sure.
I think when it comes to the question of taxing people making a lot of money or corporations that are perceived to be making a lot of money, Seattle has always gone in favor of that tax. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that is basically what we saw here is that where maybe the electorate on some, the question of the Seattle Police Department might be a little more kind of moderate than it what used to be. There's no indication that the voting base of Seattle has swung right at all when it comes to, what a lot of people describe as more progressive taxation.
Hmm.
And this just really affirms that. I think that the Seattle Chamber of Commerce is maybe again showing that its grasp on that its ability to kind of reach voters sort of
Hmm.
seems to end at the public safety question, and for years now has basically fallen flat when it comes to trying to convince voters not to support initiatives or candidates who want to tax large businesses and rich people in the city.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Jumpstart has survived as long as it has because it has had support from a number of members of the public and the council, too. Those are good points there. I did want to just kind of follow this down the path. If 1A does indeed end up winning out, as it certainly appears to be happening right now, what does happen then? Because I know some council members were talking to me about this. They were concerned about 1A because they weren't sure it was a fully legal way to bring in funding, and that's why they supported 1B. Is there going to be some sort of legal challenge to 1A in the future? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I would think so. Again, the chamber has shown it's willing to bring lawsuits. I mean,
Yep,
they sued to repeal the Jumpstart tax,
that's
and
right.
ultimately that didn't play out. And now, which is kind of ironic that their option was to use that tax to fund housing here.
Yeah,
Um, Tiffany McCoy, I talked to her briefly last night.
who's the head of House Our Neighbors? I just had that soundbite off the top. Keep going.
right at her party, she she had a scratchy voice. She was losing her voice, clearly having a good time.
Hmm.
She told me that she fully expects that the chamber will bring a lawsuit against this. I don't know. I mean, things seem to be opening up a little bit on in the state, subtly, but on the state's ability and local municipalities' ability to bring these kind of more
Yeah,
progressive taxation. The capital gains option has opened up. This probably has a better chance because it's not an income tax on the people earning over $1 million. It's
right,
basically a payroll tax on the companies who are paying their employees $1 million. So
right.
it's kind of a way to avoid that income tax question. And I mean, payroll taxes, the Jumpstart tax is a payroll tax, and
That's right.
that has been upheld. And so I suspect there will be a legal challenge, and but I don't think it's a slam dunk for the people bringing that challenge.
Fair enough. I'm very interested to see what happens there. Again, we're talking a new agency that's going to have a lot of money in the next couple years if indeed this does go through. I did want to talk about briefly also on the ballot here, David, two school levies for Seattle appear to have passed comfortably based on election night results. The capital levy got about 72% of the vote. The levy that covers staff and program costs, 78%. This would not be news except for one reason. There was an opposition campaign to these levies for the first time in, I'm going to say, a decade at least, David, and the no side did not win, clearly here. But the question it was raising, at least with the capital levy, still stands. How are levies intended to build more schools going to help a school district that very recently was talking about closing and consolidating schools due to shrinking enrollment in certain locations? These are levies. This is a levy with the capital levy that builds more capacity, and capacity has been a big problem here. David, some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that probably is why there's a 8 or whatever 6 point difference between the two,
Yeah,
which is not huge, but notable that the capital levy has slightly less support than the operations levy,
yeah,
where 72% is still an enormous number.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think again, I don't know that the details of levies always matters all
yeah,
that much for Seattle voters. I've said it for years, and I'll say it again, which is I will assume all levies will pass until one doesn't, and
yeah,
that has not betrayed me yet.
yeah.
And so, even if there is a no campaign here, I don't know what the margin on the last school levy was before this one, but the no campaign clearly didn't have a lot of traction because 72% passing anything, even in Seattle, is significant
Yeah,
and resounding.
I'm trying to think of the last one that didn't pass. I always go back to Mayor McGinn's transportation measure that wasn't all that well put together in the early 2010s, and that fell short. But other than that, you're right. The Seattle voters do like to support these. I did want to touch on this briefly, though. You got this operations levy. The Times reports that it makes up 16% of the district's budget. So athletic programs, special education, security personnel, some pretty big parts of our schools. And it just brings me back, David, to this age-old question I have about school levies and how they differ from district to district. Seattle really doesn't have to worry about funding these programs. People always vote for them. 3 out of 4 voters are supporting these levies basically every time. But you head outside the Seattle metro area, a very different story for smaller districts. And I think that really creates some inequity around our state. And that's a sub-story I always see in these levy stories.
Yeah, and I don't follow this stuff closely because schools is its own
it's its own monster.
can of worms.
I bet. Yeah.
But my understanding is there has been some kind of legal questions about these levies and whether that is creating this kind of patchwork system. I live in Kitsap County, and pretty consistently North Kitsap approves these levies and South Kitsap rejects them. It might be different this time around, actually. The South Kitsap one was leading when I checked last. But still, I think, it creates just within individual counties this kind of difference where one school district is getting resources and the other isn't. I don't know kind of what the end game is on the legal question here, but certainly something that a lot of people are thinking about.
Absolutely. At
even more exacerbated on when it comes to bonding, because bonding, when you bond, you need 60% of the vote. And so basically none of them except in King County pass or except in Seattle. And so that really makes that gap even bigger.
Absolutely. Good point there, indeed. All right, well, up next, a vote on less lethal weapons and crowd control when it comes to the Seattle Police Department came through the Seattle City Council this week. The council not in total agreement about this one. We'll get into some of their concerns and what's going to happen next for the SPD. Coming up on Now Hear This. Well, the Seattle City Council this week passed a bill allowing police officers, in some cases, to use so-called less lethal weapons like tear gas, pepper spray, and blast balls for crowd control during protests, for example. This is a departure from the stance of councils in the past who wanted a lot more oversight on this issue and wanted to ban a number of these so-called less lethal weapons. And while legislation sponsor Bob Kettle says he is satisfied with the final bill, Councilmember Kathy Moore is worried it might not pass judicial muster when a federal judge looks at it.
In the end of the day, this is about protecting the rights for those to gather an assembly and to have their protests heard, their free speech.
We have to get it right. And I don't know that the court is necessarily going to believe or find that this is an adequate policy.
And that federal judge piece is important because this crowd control legislation is the only issue left to be taken care of in the federal consent decree process that's been hanging over the Seattle Police Department for 13 years. And not all council members were on board with this legislation. It was a 6-3 vote with Moore, Rink, and Hollingsworth all voting no. I just wanted your take on this to start, David. What did you make of that vote? What did you think of this final legislation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to know is that the ban on so-called less lethal weapons never went into effect for various legal reasons. In some ways, what this legislation does is codify what the protocols that Seattle Police Department were operating on already.
Yeah, and links them up with a few more pieces of state law, too. Keep going.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one piece of it. I think the thing about this that stands out, though, is it does. I think the one device that has always been the most, well, tear gas has always been the kind of most controversial, of course, but this use of blast balls has always been kind of caught the most attention because, to use tear gas had always required approval from the mayor's office. Which
has to declare a state of civil emergency. That's right.
Whereas blast balls had been much more, I don't want to say casual, but the
right, not
Seattle
needing
Police
that
Department,
level of approval. Sure. Mm-hmm.
No, and they were used frequently. They haven't been used since 2020, but for years before that, every May Day they'd be using them, and so this was kind of the big question of this legislation, and this legislation elevates their use to that same level where the mayor needs to declare a state of emergency.
Yep.
And so, I know some folks are frustrated that the council passed this at all, feeling like, that they shouldn't be taking these steps to allow this to go forward. That said, under these new rules, the Seattle Police Department is more bound in its ability to use particularly these blast balls. So that'll be interesting to see if that makes a difference. Again, the protest scene has been pretty quiet since
Right.
2020, so these
Right.
policies really have not been put to the test.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, the big question is, how does Judge Robart, who's overseeing the consent decree, receive this information?
Hmm.
Um, you know, federal judges, it's not like there's a lot of sources in the
Yeah.
in his chambers. We don't usually
Right.
know what he thinks until he says what he thinks.
Yeah.
But what he does with this information, I don't know. And I think any kind of trying to read the tea leaves of
Yeah.
how this will play out is difficult to know. So, the hope from the people who passed it is this marks the end of the consent decree.
Right.
I have seen the consent decree declared over several times over many
Yeah.
years, and yet here
Uh-huh.
we still are. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't count those chicks until they hatch.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I did want to touch on one twist here. The amendment that said other police jurisdictions would have to comply with Seattle laws if they provide mutual aid in these kind of crowd situations. That did not pass. And I wonder what that means. Councilmember Kettle says, with that in place, other agencies wouldn't help out Seattle. But then Councilmember Moore was saying, shouldn't all law enforcement agencies be on the same page when they're in Seattle? Some thoughts about that issue? That feels like, I don't know, a little bit of unfinished business to me.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Again, it's tough to know until it's tested, and
Yep.
there hasn't been the opportunity to test it in a while.
Yeah.
Um,
Give the Trump administration a few more months, David. We'll see
Yeah,
what happens.
exactly.
But
Right,
yeah.
exactly. So yeah, I mean, especially during 2020, it was pretty common to have these mutual aid, officers from other cities come in. I can understand. I can certainly understand why, if you are legislating and regulating Seattle, how Seattle responds to protests,
Hmm.
it makes a lot of sense that you would want the people coming into Seattle to help you out to follow the same rules that you set for your own police department. That said, you can sort of understand Councilmember Kettle's concern that by overly regulating that they just won't come at all.
Yeah.
My sense is when departments come into Seattle, they follow the direction of the Seattle Police Department. So I
Sure.
would think that at least that the de facto
Right.
result would be that they are following the same policies of the Seattle Police Department. But I think the last few weeks of the Trump administration have been a good reminder that de facto norms don't always hold up, and so you can understand why some council members would wanted to write this into the law.
Yeah, yeah, I'm interested to see, and it's not that I want this crowd control policy to be tested at all, but you're right. When you don't have those actual tests with large scale protests, it's difficult to know how this is going to be employed. I did want to touch on another piece in case you missed it, folks. There was a slugfest of a public hearing last week on the comprehensive plan for the city of Seattle. It had to be quote unquote cut short after 5 hours because of winter weather. Wanted to make sure people got home. That didn't go over well with some commenters, but there will be an opportunity for more public comment in the future because this was the first public hearing for the plan under the leadership of Councilmember Hollingsworth Special Committee, and it will not be the last. So, David, I just wanted to get a quick take from you. Anything jump out at you from last week and seeing this struggle over future urban growth in our city really get revived again, I guess?
What stood out to me is I think the public input process is going to have a lot of sway on how this council legislates this. Which, this is in some ways the most controversial part of all housing debates, which is who is influencing policymakers when it comes to housing.
Right.
And I think the hearing last week made pretty clear that this council is listening pretty intently to the comments they are receiving from people who live in Seattle already, which I would say have tilted a lot more negatively toward some of the proposed changes, particularly the neighborhood centers around commercial areas that would add density in places like Maple Leaf,
Yep.
or Madison Valley, Madison Park. And they expressed a lot of frustration that they felt like those comments aren't being taken into consideration by OPCD, and that the window for commenting hasn't been large enough. The counter argument that some folks have made is that process always kind of favors people who have the time and energy to submit these comments and show up to City Hall, and B, a lot of growth planning is about how we accommodate people who are going to be here eventually. And of course, people who have not moved here yet are not commenting on this plan. But so that's always just kind of an interesting piece of this housing debate. And I think what I took away from last meeting is this city council is taking pretty seriously the comments they're getting from the people who live here now.
Right, right. And it's a newer city council. You have to take that into account too, and just realizing that a lot of the questions the council has been asking, this is a process that has been going on for many years within the city, but this is really the most public-facing piece of it now that the mayor has dropped some legislation. And there's something that I'm keeping an eye on here, David. I thought that I saw a date on this recently, but I feel like mid-February is about the time we could see potentially a legal appeal to what the mayor's put out here, the environmental impact statement for the comp plan here. And I just start thinking about this because this process has been delayed so much already. Do you anticipate seeing a legal battle here when it comes to the comp plan? Because we have a lot of neighborhoods, as you say, that are really upset about what the mayor's proposed here.
Yes, I saw Ryan Packer of the Urbanists tweet out that there has been an appeal to the EIS.
Okay.
Which is not surprising at all. I think anyone who's ever watched any of this stuff fully expected that there would be an appeal.
Right.
That will delay things. So then the question is, there's this deadline for the city to show that it's coming into compliance with state law around adding density in the city, which I think is June, end of June. I don't know exactly when in June, but an appeal to the EIS will likely stretch out the conversations in City Hall past June. And so then it becomes this thing of, do they need to pass some kind of interim legislation to come into compliance with the state before they kind of do the full meal deal? I think the answer is yes, which that complicates things. Yes, I expect there to be an appeal. Yes, I expect that to drag this conversation on further. But what's different this time is there is this specter of the state kind of looking into what Seattle is doing, and the city has to comply with state law, and so the timing of all these things is pretty complicated.
Yeah, there's so many different pieces going on right now, and I know this committee will be meeting again. They actually weren't required to have that public hearing because they haven't actually come up with their own legislation yet. They're still working through what the mayor has been proposing to them. So we're going to see what happens. But there will be more opportunities for public comment. I have heard that from every city council member I've talked to on this one. So we'll see what happens there. But coming up, an interesting look at what's happening with Seattle's permitting process and who's leading the charge to try to potentially change it. We're going to discuss it coming up on What's Next. Well, hidden in the latter part of this week, the Governance, Accountability, and Economic Development Committee is meeting to discuss ways to improve the building permitting process. There are a few professional architects on a roundtable list here. Also, Don Blakeney, head of the U-District Partnership Group, which focuses on neighborhood economic development. And I just wanted to ask this question to you, David. Is permitting a governance issue or is it a land use issue? I just think it's so interesting to see Council President Sarah Nelson diving into a big land use topic like this. I'm thinking a little bit of the Soto housing issue from a few weeks ago that she jumped into as well. And I'm just wondering what you make of that. What's she trying to do here?
Yeah, permitting is so interesting because it seems to be the kind of uniter in, we hear that from so many people who are taking office, which is we want to reform the
clean up the process, right? Get rid of the red
process.
tape. Yeah.
Clear the red tape. And, this goes well beyond Seattle. I was reading about the Inflation Reduction Act passed by President Biden. There's a lot of questions, of course, about its future. And, one piece is that a lot of the money from that is flowing to red states because blue states like Washington have such onerous permitting processes. These projects are just not getting off the ground. And, I think you can kind of trace that all the way down to cities like Seattle, which is just layer on layer of permitting, and then staffing crisis has slowed all these things down. So people are waiting months, years to get the proper permitting. Mark Solomon, when the first thing he said when he was chosen to fill the vacant seat was he wants to take on the permitting process. Here we have Councilmember Nelson taking it on. And yet, for all the talk in all the years I've covered City Hall, there hasn't been a lot of massive overhaul of permitting. There have been some exemptions for affordable housing and things like that. But if the goal is to totally upend the system, I haven't seen that yet. And I don't know if this is what leads to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I do know that the city has seen a lot fewer permit applications in the past couple years. I saw a report on this at the end of last year. Those master use permit applications down 65% last year as compared to 2019. So meaning, maybe we don't need as many zoning inspectors out there. And I mean, the mayor was talking about this in his budget proposal in the fall, this idea to cut some positions from the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections too. So I guess I'm trying to figure out how this works. Permit applications are down. Interest rates are okay, but the financial markets are a little tenuous right now, just based on what President Trump is going to do next. I'm trying to figure out what needs to happen with our building permit process system in Seattle. What needs to change there?
Yeah, I couldn't say for sure. I think the reason permit applications are down is because of interest rates in large part,
financially motivated.
And inflation. Okay. And I think that's going to cause a lot of problems that are separate from the actual permitting process. But
Sure.
but I think you could point to the permitting process as a point of frustration because there was this kind of narrow window kind of between 2012 and 2022 maybe, where the economy was doing better and interest rates were incredibly low and demand for housing was really high. That would have been the period when you want to get as many of these housing projects through as quickly as possible. And yet a lot of them, I think, are bleeding over into these years now because the permitting process is so slow. So maybe you're a real estate developer and you wanted to build a building and you started your process in 2018 and it took 4 years to check all the boxes and suddenly interest rates go from 3% to 7%. And
COVID hits, all this, right. Yeah,
your project doesn't look so good anymore. Whereas if you had been able to kind of expedite that process within 6 months or something, you might have gotten your project off the ground before all of that changed. And so, in some ways, it matters less now, the permitting process, because it probably should have been something we took on when it really mattered the most.
Yeah, no, that's a good observation. I think the finances really drive this conversation, 90% of it, and trying to work through these other pieces with building permits, et cetera, is certainly part of that process, something that can cost a lot of these developers money. All right, well, David, it is definitely time to wrap up with you here, and I just wanted to make sure I asked you this question. When Ichiro throws out the first pitch of the 2025 baseball season for the Mariners, can't wait to see that, do you think he should just skip the pitcher's mound, do it from right field, laser the ball home from 250 feet away? What do you got?
Oh, yeah, that would be great. Watching Ichiro makes me nostalgic.
It feels like he can still do it. You know what I mean? It looks like he can.
I know. I think he threw out a first pitch last year. Maybe it was the year before that was clocked at like 90 miles per hour or something like that.
Right.
I don't know how old he is now. He's probably late 40s, maybe even 50. I don't know. And he's still in better shape than a lot of people playing now.
I know. It's like we could kind of use maybe a little platoon in right field. I'm just throwing it out there. That's very interesting. Well, David,
are you allowed to start playing again even after you've been elected to the Hall of Fame? I don't know. This is the time we need to try these things out.
Yeah, I would love to see it. What a great! I'd go to that promo night. That's for darn sure. Well, David, thanks so much for joining me. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to all the patrons who support the show. If you are not a patron, please do support the show for just $5 a month or more if you'd like on Patreon. Would definitely be appreciated. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.